Listen up, Democrats. You are fake news. Lies and facts. Save our democracy from right-wing hypocrisy. We'll keep our integrity, embrace our diversity. Whenever we're down, we always come back. So listen up, Democrats.
Hello, welcome to Progressive Oregon, a weekly engagement broadcast on progressive issues in Oregon. My name is Larry Taylor, and I'm here today with my co-host, Betsy Cunningham. If you would like to ask questions during the show, go to the Uphill Media channel on YouTube and type your questions into the chat box for this show, and we will do our best to get them answered. Betsy will prompt me if I get carried away and forget to give her an opportunity to break in. Today, our featured guest is River Gibeaut, who was a member of SDS and of the Weathermen in the late 60s and early 70s. We met at the Bernie and Brews event that we had here in Astoria, Oregon a couple of weeks ago. And we got to talking about what was happening 50 years ago. And I thought it would make a very interesting conversation today to talk about what happened to those organizations back then, what were their objectives, and where we are today. So welcome, River. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So let's start out by talking about your background and your associations, because you were more than just an observer of what went on at the SDS in Kent State, but you were an actual participant in this stuff. So give us some insight into your background and how you got there.
Well, my family came up from West Virginia when I was 4 years old in 1952, my father had a small exterminating company, and my mother was an executive secretary for the Cleveland Clinic in one of the major law firms in Cleveland. I went to Kent State after graduating in '67, and then it was known as a small conservative teachers college. My political views were progressive in the sense of supporting the civil rights struggle, but I was for the war and got progressively less for it until finally I met Students for Democratic Society, a guy named Howie Emmer, another one, Rick Erickson, and some other people who convinced me over a period of time, including my roommate who was in Vietnam twice, to change my position and recognize that the war in Vietnam was an unjust war and killing needlessly hundreds of thousands of people. So I became a radical. Then after a series of events, I was thrown off campus and a permanent injunction was put on me and 4 other guys for being threats to the very fiber of the university. After that, I went to Chicago to work in the national office of SDS, later joined Weatherman Collective organizing to build a people's army in Columbus and Akron, Ohio. And finally, I quit Weatherman when I realized that it wasn't going to work. Turned out I was right. Now I'm involved very deeply in the hopeful election of Bernie Sanders. I was involved with Bernie in 2016, and I'm involved now. To me, he's the best aspect of what happened 50 years ago. Bernie's been involved in the struggle since that time, and he stayed consistent to this time.
John, let's show some pictures that I found from that period that give the context, since many of the people in our audience were not even born in 1970. So River started college in '67. In 1968, we had the Democratic Convention, which was the last time it was a contested convention, which we might be facing in 2020. And as you can see from the picture, it was a little wild. There were huge clashes between protesters and the police. The convention itself was a brokered convention. So that happened in '68. And then we had the tragedy of the student killings in Kent State that were on May 4th of 1970. That was just a continuation of the protests against the war in Vietnam and other things. SDS, when I was pretty young. I was in high school when all this was transpiring. But from where I was on the West Coast, all I got was what was portrayed in the media, and that was that the SDS was basically a terrorist organization, and that's how it was portrayed in the media, which is really interesting now that we can go back and see what their objectives were, and we're going to talk about that with River in a little bit. If we go to the next slide, these are some of the posters, and what was fascinating about these is the slogan, "We are the 99%," and this was 50 years ago. They were talking about Occupy Chicago, where we had a continuation of the Occupy movement just a couple of years ago. The Students for a Democratic Society, which is what SDS stands for, were around education rights, ending racism, ending U.S. wars, women's liberation, stop repression, and stop police crimes. I don't know where we have made progress on any of those. Probably women's liberation, but the rest of them seem to be pretty active in this point in time. And then the final slide shows the activism that SDS was doing. So it wasn't just a small group of people, it was thousands of people involved in those activities.
I just got to say that I did a little research on this. I was telling River in the green room before we went live, and it is amazing. There's a link in the description, everybody. There's a few links in there. I dropped them just to give you some information if you're not aware. And SDS sounds an awful lot about, like, they are the progressive movement. It's the same progressive movement, same things. It's ridiculous how identical it is, and I hate to say it, but I just want to ask everybody from the original movement, what happened? What? And mission not accomplished.
Well, see, I tend to disagree with that. I mean, a friend of mine, Colin Nyberger, who was one of the people who was also issued a permanent injunction and thrown off campus, told me yesterday when we were talking that it was evolution, not revolution. That if, in fact, all the things that we fought for have evolved in a positive way since then. True, it wasn't. It didn't evolve the way we thought it would, and that's why evolution, not revolution. It takes a long time to turn a massive ship around, and to turn a country around takes a lot longer. But I would like to say something about what you said about Kent State. I think it's really important not to forget Jackson State, where Black students were killed the same year. And a lot of awareness of what happened at Jackson State lacks awareness, is because I still believe, and it's true, racism continues to influence everything. And that's why when we think of the 60s, we remember the 4 dead at Ohio, but we don't remember the dead at Jackson State. So,
that's huge. I didn't even know.
Yeah.
And most Americans remember the 4 dead in Ohio because of a song. Right.
It's the difference, it seems to me, one of the big differences now in education is when I was in high school, we had civics classes. And we had classes in history that related to what was going on. After Reagan, they began to prune away civics classes until I don't think hardly anybody has a civics class. And, what do you call it? The people who run this country are pretty smart. They know how to dumb us down and keep information away from us. They're masters at it.
Let's talk about the evolution of SDS, because that was an organization that had very idealistic goals. Walk us through the creation of SDS and what they were advocating in the beginning.
Well, if you go to 1962 in Port Huron, July 15th, a group of very early SDSers, led by Tom Hayden, wrote a position paper called the Port Huron Statement. And I think that you put it on the links below this, right, Larry?
I think John put it in the link for the show, and then I put it on the link on the Facebook page of Progressive Oregon.
Well, I'll tell you, if you read that statement, I reread it this morning. It's really an amazing statement, because it talks about the need to wake up, to realize that America isn't what we thought it was. and to urge people to form participatory democracy groups, was what SDS used to be, where people would discuss what was going on in our lives and in the world around us. And they say, I have a little note here, the questions that we want raised, this is in the statement, what is really important? Can we live in a different and better way? If we want to change society, how can we do it? Those questions are what people on those campuses in the early years discussed and worked towards. They didn't anticipate the war in Vietnam. They didn't anticipate, because how could they? Nobody knows the future until it's the present. But I think those questions are really important today. And what changed and what destroyed SDS, in my belief, is that we changed over a period of a few years from 1962 to 68, 69, from a participatory democracy organization dedicated to regional autonomy into what I consider a neo-Maoist organization ruled from top down and dedicated not to educating people, but to building the people's army. And of course, it didn't work. And it eventually died.
What are you saying? It was an attempt to build a in the streets revolution, like physical?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. What happened is after the last SDS convention in Chicago, I think it was 1969, when SDS split between what they call Progressive Labor Party, which was aligned with a Maoist political party, and Revolutionary Youth Movement, which became Weatherman, and then another group called Revolutionary Youth Movement 2. After that, our faction, Weatherman, issued a statement called "You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows," based on Bob Dylan's song, the title, because most of us were Bob Dylan freaks. And in it talked about the need to leave the campuses and begin to build a revolutionary organization and a people's army. The idea was that we would go from the campuses into the working class neighborhoods and organize working class kids to resist the war, to fight against racism, and to begin to build a Red Army, a people's army.
Could you go back and explain what the Weathermen were and how they evolved out of SDS, if they did?
Yeah, SDS and Weathermen were the same until we were all part of SDS. Then what happened, roughly 1968, the pressure on SDS from the Vietnamese who were dying by the thousands, by the Cubans, by the Black Panthers who were being murdered all over the country, to change, to be more helpful to the struggle, led some people in leadership of SDS to say that organizing was not going to do it. We need to have an armed struggle to draw, to draw energy away from Vietnam, the Black communities in Cuba, and towards white communities. And that was a really poor decision.
Were you around the conventions in Chicago in '68?
No, I was at the last convention in '69 in Chicago when we split. Actually, I was going to go, and my father didn't want me to go and offered me. He said, if you don't go to Chicago, I'll pay for a trip to New York City. And my politics weren't that committed at that point, and I really wanted to see the village. So I went that way instead.
I was talking more about the Democratic National Convention in '68.
Yeah, me too. I didn't go there because, like I said, my politics at that point weren't that strong. I was watching, but not active. I became active after I came back from New York City in '68 and was convinced by the Students for Democratic Society leadership through a series of conversations and debates that they were right. Their analysis at that point was correct.
Was it the SDS then who became so active on the Kent State campus that spawned those protests?
Yeah, well, what happened is, sorry about that, not used to these. What happened is, at first, Kent SDS was an amazing group of people. You know, people inhabit organizations, you know. So when you talk about SDS, it's sort of misleading because really SDS was a broad cover for thousands of people. You know, the group at Kent, and at that point, each chapter was autonomous, was led by a really good group of people. Howie Immers, whose father and mother were old Communist Party members, Rick Erickson and Candy Erickson. Rick's father was the former mayor of Akron, and a whole group of other people who were really committed and especially very kind. You know, they listened very well, and that's what really won my heart is they didn't preach at me, they talked with me. And it wasn't just politics. Afterwards, you go to places, their homes, for instance, and talk about things, a wide variety of things. So you became a community, not an organization. The more we became an organization and the less we became a community, the less popular we became. If we had stuck to our principles and stayed autonomous and treated each other with a lot of respect and consideration and kindness, who knows where we'd be today.
So it sounds like the organization morphed and then got on the radar of the FBI, and then they took control of the propaganda. Did you see that coming, and did you see how that evolved?
Well, I tell you, I was like 19, 20 years old. I didn't, but there's a really good book by a man who was at Kent during the shootings and was wounded. His name is Thomas M. Grace, and he wrote a book called Kent State, Death and Dissent in the Long 60s. And I highly recommend that book. It gives you an overall view of what happened in America during that time frame and how it influenced people at Kent. So I'm in a number of places, but you know, there's so many real, you know, when you make a general statement about Kent or SDS or Weatherman, really it misses the fact that there are human beings who were there, and the organization is just an easy cover. You know, I think when you lose sight of human beings and start looking at organizations, you lose a lot of what really made things happen and stop things from happening. We used to say revolution is one-on-one. You know, it's not theory. It's one human being. In fact, in the Port Huron statement, it talks about the need to relate to each other with love, not ideology. You know, when you see a revolution as a conversation, a series of conversations and actions like this, you know, there's a very different world than talking about what destroyed SDS or, you know, it was human beings meeting human beings and facing those problems and questions about if we want to change society, how can we do it? And what's really important? And can we live in a different and better way? You know, when we discussed those questions, and we did, with honesty and integrity and with ability to listen, not just make statements, that's when we transformed from centrist youth to revolutionary youth.
I got to say, that sounds awesome. And it really sounds great and like the Bernie way. My question today, if we were to apply the same principles, is that we are faced with a large number of white supremacists in this country. And we are faced with a different circumstance, the climate crisis. And in Green Room, you mentioned, you know, these things take time. We're out of time. So can we really apply that? I'm going to sit down and have me a discourse with a MAGA hat, try to explain the climate crisis, why we need to work together in love. You know,
well, I tell you, frankly, we need to do that. I mean, it's not. I agree that there's an existential crisis facing us, totally unique in the terms of the environment. I'd be surprised if humanity is here the way we know it in the next 30 to 50 years. And I'm not sure that there's much we can do. We can try, but it looks pretty bleak. And what you said earlier, though, racism. If you think racism is bad now, I remember going through the South in the early '60s, and I remember going in Cleveland, Ohio, my father's pest control company, helping him as a kid in the ghettos to open doors to get in when people weren't there, and to see how Black people lived in the North, and then come back to my lower middle class neighborhood in Cleveland. That's when racism was really intense.
Well, I mean, we can argue the finer points of which time period is worse. I think you have a lot more dead Black people today, thanks to police and thanks to a lot of other things that are out of our control. Corporate media is not the same. Police are not the same. Our government is not the same. And so I just, to me, I mean, I find it really interesting that there was this group, and the reason you're saying that it fell apart is because they were going more in a militant People's Army way. And I just have this feeling, and I've talked about this before with this audience, that when we hit 2020, and both sides have said this, regardless of who wins, it's not going to be a happy, let's hug each other and move on democracy kind of ending, right?
Of course not.
Right.
I hope you didn't think that that's what I meant.
No. But the ultimate goal would be that we all need to get together, communicate, or love each other, or we're not going to survive.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering I guess where I'm going is I'm wondering what tactics SDS would use today to try to make that happen, given I don't think we're facing the same kind of an enemy. I think it's worse. Because it's had a military-industrial complex, it's had decades and decades to build up,
Trump is qualitatively worse than Nixon.
Yes.
No question.
Yes.
And we've never been, to me, in a more dangerous situation in relationship to our democracy.
Yes.
And I'm 70 years old. I'll be 71 this year. I wouldn't be active if I didn't feel like Bernie feels, that we can't sit on the sidelines and watch these right-wing oligarchs destroy what's left of our representative democracy.
Right.
So, what I'm doing is in my Facebook and in meetings with people, I try to engage people in conversation about what's happening politically and what's happening in our personal lives. Because revolution is internal and external. It's family, friends, society, and the world all at once. And they're all equally important. That's one of the things that women's liberation showed us, that you can't deny oppression in the family at the same time fighting oppression in other aspects of our world. Oppression is oppression and needs to be admitted and explored and ended. And that's a personal responsibility.
Nice. I like that, and it seems to go back to the revolution as a one-on-one thing with your family and friends.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Most of the people I knew back then, I know most of them now in one form or another, and most of them have done very progressive lives. I'm very proud of the people I knew at Kent and the people I knew in Weatherman before it went underground.
Awesome. Thank you.
Let's go back and talk about how SDS changed, because if we keep if our organizations keep destroying themselves, then we keep starting over, and that seems to be one of the reasons why we look at the goals from 50 years ago and have much of the same issues going on now. It's interesting that in a democratic society where we elect all of our leaders, we have not been able to elect people who have gotten us farther. And I don't know if that says the system's not working, or if who we end up electing is actually more representative of who we truly are as opposed to what we think we are. But so when the SDS evolved, was that an agreed upon evolution?
What do you mean agreed upon?
Like, did people sit down and say, "Hey, let's turn into an army," or was it charismatic leaders that said, "Hey, we need to be an army. Come follow me"? How did that evolution happen?
Well, I'll tell you, when I was sent to Chicago, because I couldn't go back on campus at Kent, me and Colin Nyberger were sent to Chicago National Office of SDS. Okay. One of my jobs, I had two jobs that I was supposed to do. One was to find and destroy Kent State's literature bill to SDS because we were a poor chapter, and to send as much free literature as possible. And the second one was to look at the leadership, at national leadership, and to give my opinion of who I thought we should join. It turned out that the leadership of SDS had already at Kent joined what became Revolutionary Youth and then Weatherman. So, and I did send literature to Kent and destroyed our literature bill. But in my analysis of meeting the leadership of the national leadership, I told Kent that we shouldn't join either faction. We should stay autonomous, because both factions, as far as I could see, were a bunch of this is my analysis then. There were a bunch of ego-tripping, selfish people. To give you an example, I went to lunch at a Greek restaurant with some of the leadership of National SDS. And after lunch, the group ran out of the restaurant, leaving the bill. And, I ran with them because I didn't know what else to do. But from then on, I realized that these people were not people that I would respect or admire. I look at the leadership, and I'm sorry that the leadership wasn't as worthy of the people as it turned out, and it weren't as concerned with their own egos, and not as concerned with. They lost track of individual humanity and became ideologues. And we follow them right down that rabbit hole.
Structurally, how did they become the leaders of the organization?
Well, SDS was a pretty loose group of non, of independent autonomous SDS chapters. And what the leadership did was they sort of seized power from the top. It wasn't, the leadership existed amongst themselves in Chicago and at the ruling class schools, Columbus, Harvard, Radcliffe, all those places. And they controlled the speakers' platforms. And, we only had three choices. We had the Progressive Labor Party choice in SDS. We had what became known as Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, and the Action Faction, which turned into the Weather Bureau. So, we lost the connection with the democratic, a participatory democracy became not as important as the dictates from the top-down leadership. And that's when we really lost it.
Interesting. So it was a loose gentleman's agreement that wasn't formalized in any kind of a structure, and so the people lost control of it.
Well, we really never had control of it because, by the definition, in autonomous chapters, you didn't want much control. What you wanted was it's like comparing structures. You take a pyramid and you take a circle. And most organizations are pyramidal with the leadership at the top and the rest of us below. In a circle, leadership moves. It's situational and tactical, and everybody occupies something. A lot of people occupy positions of leadership and let them go. We became very rigid.
Well,
I think that.
I'm sorry. It sounds like what Larry's getting to, and what I hear here is, and we see this in other organizations as well, is that when put in a circle situation, some human beings choose to become leaders or take the opportunity to become leaders, and others look for leadership to follow. That's kind of human nature. And
Yeah.
if that's not regulated, that's where it goes, in my view, right?
Yeah, it's a real problem of how do you form organizations that maintain a real connection with participatory democracy, and have leaders who don't try to end up becoming more important than the organization. And
Bingo.
and frankly, I don't know how you do it. I mean, and I don't think anybody else does either. But we have to struggle to do it. Everything is in process, right? Nothing is. Our minds and DNA is geared towards drawing conclusions, and really, it's an ongoing evolutionary struggle of our species to try to figure out how to share the resources of the world in an equitable fashion. Clearly, I call it vampire capitalism, does not work. What does work is not clear. We label socialism, we label all these labels, but really whatever is going to work is yet to come into being. And sometimes putting a label like socialism, which I am a democratic socialist like Bernie, but putting a label can inhibit the development of a spontaneous and organic evolution of a democratic struggle.
And that actually reflects, I forget who said it, I think it was Thomas Jefferson, that countries need to reinvent themselves periodically, which we haven't actually done in 200 years.
Well, we've tried to do it. I mean, if you look at the history of the progressive movements, from the Wobblies to the organizations of Pull, we've been fighting this struggle since the birth of our nation. It's not well known by most people because the ruling class always writes the history. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been people and organizations since probably before the founding of this country that haven't struggled for a just, fair, and equitable society. Because they have. This is not SDS was only one small part of a wave that's been sweeping through our species probably since we left the savannas. And if we don't, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, finish. I was just going to interject a question from someone.
If we don't destroy ourselves through the environment, I believe we'll be okay. I mean, I have some sort of faith in our species that eventually we will learn how to share the resources of the planet, because we're an immature species. We haven't been around that long, and we're struggling mightily with this conception of what is consciousness and how do we treat each other.
Betsy.
So there's a question from Dennis from Germany. Does he agree that thanks to the Red Scare, destroying the Union, Socialist Party, etc., is reason where we are here today?
Yeah, I think that the ruling class in this country is pretty smart. After Nixon lost the first election, which the Democrats basically stole in Chicago and in Illinois, the ruling class right wing got together and began to put forth a series of papers saying that I think it was called the Powell papers or something, but they said that they needed to develop a media that was representative of their ideology. They needed to develop universities. They needed to form alliances with people in the South. The oligarchy, the 1%, whatever you want to call them, spends fortunes fighting for their right to continue to oppress people and destroy our world. They have professional propagandists. They have people who work 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. We on the left, the progressives, we're sort of like the Minutemen or like Native people fighting white people. We come together, spend a little time together, and split apart. The right wing stays together, stays centered, and continues to fight night and day. And that's why they win more than we do. Well, that's what I think anyway.
Well, I'm going to interject my 2 cents. My dad was actually part of the communist purge during the McCarthy era. He was a union organizer. And many unions in this country were formed with alliances by the Communist Party. So I think it actually did move a lot of people away from those formal organizations and affiliations. You know, they would, and in the era for, I have known people in the SDS. I'm not old enough to have been part of that, but the people I knew went into issue-oriented or identity politics, like Teamsters for a Democratic Union, for example, was founded with an alliance with redneck Teamsters, you know, and it still exists today, right? You know, and they learned to not be afraid of the word communist, the redneck Teamsters, when they realized what SDS folks, you know, advocated for. So, you know, I think we're all part of, I think you're right. We're on this, some of it is just a regurgitation of the past.
You know the term red diaper babies?
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
I identify as a red diaper baby. Absolutely.
Yeah, you know, for other people who might not know, there were red diaper babies were kids who were raised in by Communist Party parents, and SDS had a lot of red diaper babies, and I'll tell you, everyone I met were really cool. They were really, I was amazed because I had not really had experience with communists before, and I bought that whole John Wayne myth about, you know, communism being the evil, horrible thing, because we confused what was happening in Russia and China with the best of what socialism means. You know.
Yeah, we're confusing the political system of democratic centralism, which is what the communists in Russia did, with the social structure, economic structure of communism.
I'm totally there. I agree. You know, it's one of the beautiful things that's happening now is that socialism, because of Bernie, is no longer the booty boo it was when we were young. You know, more. I mean, when I call myself a democratic socialism, I do it because Bernie called himself that, and I agree with it. And people relate to that now. The vampire capital. I call it vampire capitalism because vampires live off the life force of people, and that's what these guys are doing. But you know, they spent a lot of time during and after World War II discrediting progressives because they had labeled them as Russian simps and Chinese, you know what I mean? And they were successful. But now their success is wearing thin because, let's face it, I mean, every day the rich grow richer and the rest of us grow poorer.
It was interesting watching the reaction in the media to Bernie Sanders' speech this past week because people listened to it and they said, yeah, he really nailed it, but still there's this wariness of him because of the label of socialism. So it's not, we're still not a complete acceptance of that, even though he clearly demonstrates, you know, the path that we've been on since FDR. Yeah,
he's the logical progression since that. Now you're right. Since FDR and from the best parts of the 60s, the Port Huron Statement, you know, he's one of us. He's the only politician that I trust completely because he has a track record that's so long and so consistent. And, you know, he's the man.
I agree with you, River, 100%. And one of the things that turned me off of Elizabeth Warren is I'm not a socialist. You know, feeding into that rhetoric, you know.
Well, you know, Elizabeth Warren is sort of left of center from Hillary Clinton and, you know, those corporate Democrats. She's better than them, but she's politically, I think, timid to take the next step to say, hey, look, we really need to reevaluate what democratic socialism means and embrace it as opposed to buying into the ruling class narrative.
Thank you for saying what you just said, ruling class narrative, because we forget that the reason why the word socialism is treated the way it is today and why Bernie had to fight tooth and nail to change that narrative is because mainstream media presents the narrative that corporate interests and our government provide, you know, and that's, you know, you were facing the same thing in 1968, but it wasn't nearly as powerful as it is today.
Yeah, we didn't have Fox News. And Fox News was a direct result of the war in Vietnam and the political radicalization of youth in this country. I think one reason that we have a college system that leaves students with $50,000, $100,000 debt is to discourage people from going to college and keep as much people as possible ignorant and immersed in trying to pay debt off, as opposed to trying to understand what's being done to them by these vampire capitalists and their puppet politicians.
Absolutely.
But one thing I would like to say that, what you said earlier about why we don't get leaders that reflect what we really are, or are the leaders really reflecting what we really are? Well, if you look at the rigged game of how this country's elections are set up, the founding fathers made a point of making sure that elections were privately financed. And the Electoral College was the final to say, because they were scared of letting any kind of people besides rich white landowners have any say in this country. So as long as politicians have to raise $1 million or $2 million or $3 million to get elected, they're going to get most of that money from the 1% or their what I call Renfields, the less than 1%, but still living off the life forces of people. We have to end the private financing of elections, and we have to end the Electoral College if we're going to have any chance at having representative democracy. What we have now is representative plutocracy.
It's interesting every time the topic of the Electoral College is approached because, excuse me, excuse me, there are people who believe that it's a sacred institution created by the founding fathers and it can't be touched without really understanding how it came about into being. And this comes out when we talk about the National Popular Vote movement, which takes that structure but bends it a little bit so that it ends up being a reflection of the popular vote. And we just keep repeating the conversations with those people about why that is not a sacred institution. But the thought of opening up a constitutional convention to do a revision of the Constitution itself scares the crap out of everyone, because once you open up that, you could get a restructuring of the government like they did in the second constitutional convention. And with who's controlling things now, God only knows what we would end up with.
But we don't have to do that. It would seem to me that if we ended the private financing of elections, right? And if we ended gerrymandering, then you would have people who are running for office be dependent not on money, but on votes of the average person.
Yes.
So, I would say if you open up a constitutional convention, like you said, it's dangerous. But if we end gerrymandering and if we end the public financing of the private financing of elections, then we can elect those people you talked about earlier, which are people who really represent us, people, and not the wealthiest 1%.
That's very true.
We don't have to go as far as the convention. We can have steps that can be easily done if enough of us commit to doing it.
But okay, catch-22, right? Because in order to do that, we have to finance the people we need elected. So we have to use the system to put people in the system to change the system. That's what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, it's never, it's multidimensional. It's not linear. We got to simultaneously do all kinds of things.
Yes.
That's where conversation, by definition being linear, leads us down a lot of false trails. We have to look at this thing with the complexity that it is. And then we have to say individually, okay, given that, once we have a better understanding of what's going on around us, then we say, okay, now personally, what can I do, given my resources, given my age, given my whatever, what can I do that won't destroy my life completely and take it over to help the evolution of this country from a representative plutocracy to a representative democracy? And that's what I'm asking myself, and most people I know, that's the question we're asking.
That well said. And I think, as I said earlier, I just bring it back to the climate crisis. We got less than 10 years to do that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Anybody not scared of what's facing us now is delusional.
Yeah, I mean, I look out the window and I have the same view you do, and it's gorgeous out there. And it's like, where's the impending disaster? This is the same beautiful day we had 20 years ago. But it's just because people don't acknowledge the facts that they are being told on a daily basis, and they're using empirical observations to deny the facts that things are changing.
I mean, let's face it, it's scary. I mean, it's really scary. And you know, we're human beings, we're little animals, and we don't like to be scared. You know, and if you face the realities of our situation, then most people go, oh no, I can't take that too long. I just can't face it. And they go back to their daily head in the sand grind.
Of paying their college debts.
Yeah. Thank you, Ronald Reagan.
Yeah. Betsy, was there any more questions on the line?
No, I don't see any.
Well.
What final words of wisdom do you have for us, River?
An unexamined life is not worth living, you know, and I would just urge people to try to see beyond their immediate moment and try to understand what's going on environmentally, politically, and socially. And also ask ourselves, how do we relate to our husbands and wives and children and friends? And can we be a little kinder and a little more understanding?
That's it? That's all we need to do?
Well, hey, you know, and also in gerrymandering, in the public financing of private financing of elections, and help elect Bernie Sanders and people like him, because it's the best hope we have. That's
well said. It's really been I've learned a lot from you. Really appreciate you coming on. Thank you for all you've done for democracy.
I appreciate you too, and thank you for all the stuff you're doing for democracy.
Well, one little bit at a time from each of us, right?
Inshallah.
Awesome.
Yeah, we'll have you back certainly when we get into next year, as we get closer to the nomination. It's going to be very interesting how all of this pans out.
True. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll see you around town.
Yeah.
So to conclude with, we have some upcoming events. Getting back to the daily grind, we have a continuation of the May 19th State Central Committee meeting of the Democratic Party that's scheduled for Tuesday. This is where we're going to make a final attempt at correcting the flaws of the delegate selection plan. Even though the odds of us making any substantial changes to correct its flaws are low, there's still a dedicated group of people that are working towards that. If you have been living in a cave or have been camping away from the internet, you probably are unaware of the DNC debates that have now been the lineup of each of the debates on June 20th and 26th and 27th have been lined up. On the 26th, we have basically Senators Warren and Booker plus Beto and Julian Castro, plus the other 6 on the 26th. And then on the 27th, we have the interesting lineup of Bernie Sanders, Mayor Pete, Kamala Harris, and Joe Biden.
Hey, we'll be broadcasting at least the Sanders one, because I think they're going to run it, and they've been doing House Party. So I think if we have a legal stream, we will stream it on Uphill Media. You guys can join us in chat to watch that. If they provide a Warren one, we'll do that one too, just for fun. So there you go. Yes,
we're hoping everyone will have house parties. If you have not gotten involved in the Bernie Sanders campaign, you're more than welcome to join and host a viewing party that night with your neighbors, doing just what River said, creating this into a person-to-person revolution, because that is the only way he's going to win. Final notes, we have established a grievance process for the Democratic Party of Oregon. If you find yourself being subjected to any kind of verbal harassment and any other form of unprofessional conduct by your leadership or by your peers, please go to pdpo.org and report the harassment, and we will get back to you and figure out a way to get it corrected, because until we stop the character assassination and marginalization of people within the party, we are not going to be able to work together. the establishment keeps preaching unity, and for them, unity means you people need to stop fighting us and do what we say. And we reject that definition of unity. We think unity is treating each other with respect and following the rules. Were you going to say something, John?
No.
Oh.
Not this time.
So one way to learn about Robert's Rules of Order, which is the rules that glue us together, and this was also an undercurrent of our discussion with River. You know, our democracy is just a gentleman's agreement that we're all going to behave well and follow these rules, and we have little protection against people who want to trample all over the rules when you get down below the actual legal system itself. We have to follow the rules and treat each other equally and fairly as we have agreed upon. One way to learn about how to do that is to immerse yourself in parliamentary procedure as you engage in discussions and make decisions. And you can do that at advancementofdemocracy.org, where we have about 21 videos, and you can just binge watch them all you want. If you would like to get involved in the Oregon for Bernie movement, we have a collection of 66 leaders now from across the state who are working together to promote Bernie Sanders, and our goal is that he wins the primary next year by 60%. If you would like to get involved, go to OregonForBernie.org and sign up, and we would be delighted to have you. We need leaders in specific counties still. So if you're from Umatilla, Hood River, Wasco, Marion, Deschutes, or Jefferson County, we would love to have you get involved and start working to get Bernie Sanders elected. We're especially looking at Native Americans and Hispanics in those communities because they are extremely underrepresented. We have strong leadership like in Marion County, but it tends to be all of the Caucasian flavor. We would appreciate your donations to move this stuff along. We have established 3 GoFundMe sites. We have a GoFundMe site for printing up bumper stickers. We have some great designs that we would love to get out into the public. As soon as we collect our GoFundMe goal for that, we will print them up and we will distribute them for free through the Bernie Sanders support groups across the state and get those distributed. We have a second GoFundMe for posting custom signs around the state. We have artist Brian Heath, who will travel anywhere in the state to plant a custom-made sign on your property. If you have a great location facing the road, they only cost $27 in materials. So if you would go there and give us a $27 donation, we will get another sign planted. Our goal is to get 100 signs around rural Oregon. And then finally, we need to raise funds to send our delegates to the convention next year. We're assuming that we have around 30 delegates that will need to go. There is no time to do personal fundraising between the election of the delegates and the convention itself. It's less than a month, and the prices are going to be higher because we're going to be purchasing late plane tickets to get to Madison, Wisconsin. So we would appreciate contributions on that GoFundMe site as well. Those are all listed at OregonForBernie.org. John, did you show us the signs of what people will get? Yes, you have. And finally, we have awesome Bernie products that we have listed on the Oregon for Bernie site. Some of these products are created and distributed by Uphill Media. I just got my blue hoodie, the one in the upper left corner, and it is so beautiful. I can't wait to use it and wear it out in public. As we get into the parade season, it's very important for people who are supporting Bernie Sanders to be, wearing his name, because this is how you win elections, is to really show presence and sear his name into everyone's brain. And finally, soon we will launch the much anticipated program Parliamentary Talk, where we will be working through situations on how to solve your parliamentary issues. I had a fascinating one come up this past week. We have an organization here called Encore, which does classes for people 50 and older. They had a meeting, but they didn't have a quorum, and they have these rigid mandates within their bylaws, and so they knew that I was teaching a class on parliamentary procedure at the college this summer. They asked me to give them some guidance on how to navigate the quagmire that they found themselves in. Like, how do they move forward if they don't have officers? And that's exactly the kind of thing which we can talk through on Parliamentary Talk. So please, if you are interested in listening to this, we think it's going to be a fascinating show. Subscribe to the show announcements, and we will let you know as soon as we start up. We hope to start up within a few weeks, where we're just waiting for one or two things to happen that's going to enable us to proceed. That's our show for today. Thank you, Betsy. Thank you, John.
Yeah, and donate if you can. Just throw the donate up there. Why
Yes.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Appreciate it. It was really a great show, great audience. Give me a second. I'm just going to put the card up there. I don't have a song, but I want to go out with Bernie's speech, a little portion of Bernie's speech, because it was so perfect. And it kind of encapsulates the tie-in between FDR, his socialism, SDS, their socialism, our socialism, what it really means. So let's listen to Bernie.
But on February 20th, 1939, over 20,000 Nazis held a mass rally, not in Berlin, not in Rome, but in Madison Square Garden, in front of a 30-foot banner of George Washington bordered with swastikas in New York City. New York City. But back then, those American extremists could not replicate the success of their authoritarian brethren across the ocean. Because we in the United States, thank God, made a different choice than Europe did in responding to the era's social and economic crisis. We rejected the ideology of Mussolini and Hitler, and we instead embraced the bold and visionary leadership of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then the leader of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Together with organized labor, leaders in the African American community, and progressives inside and outside the Democratic Party, Roosevelt led a transformation of the American government and the American economy. Like today, the quest for transformative change was opposed by big business, by Wall Street, by the political establishment, by the Republican Party, and by the conservative wing of FDR's own Democratic Party. And he faced the same scare tactics then that we experience today: red baiting, xenophobia, racism, and anti-Semitism. In a famous 1936 campaign speech, Roosevelt stated, and I quote, "We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace: business and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering." They had begun to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. We know now that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. And Roosevelt concluded, and I quote, "Never before in all our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. That was FDR in 1936. Now, although it does sound, I must say it does sound a little contemporary, doesn't it?